Welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Irene Varley, Director of Education for the Dibble Institute, and joining me today is Kathy Gidray, the webinar organizer. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Irene. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, I'm excited to be facilitating this webinar as our programs reflect much of the research and issues Kathryn Edin will identify today. Before we begin, though, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. If you experience any audio difficulties during this broadcast, please note the phone number listed here or on the link in your email connecting you to the webinar. You can both listen on the phone while viewing the broadcast on your computer, and we recommend that you use earphones while connected to the broadcast. Should you have any other technical questions, you may send inquiries through that question box located on the control panel, if you can see that. We will have time for questions in a 10 to 15-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you would hold your questions until then. And if your question is not addressed during this time, you will definitely receive an answer through email. Our broadcast is a short 60 minutes, including the Q&A. It is being recorded and will be available next week on our website at the Dibble Institute. And we certainly invite you to share it with colleagues who couldn't be with us today. The Dibble Institute is a national independent nonprofit organization dedicated to equipping young people with the skills and knowledge they need to develop healthy romantic relationships now and for their futures. Charlie Dibble, and here's a picture of Charlie and his wife Helen, is our founder. He was an aeronautical engineer who in his retirement years was dedicated to working with young people. From them, he heard many painful stories following their parents' relationship issues. It was a time the divorce rate was reaching its peak, and Charlie was concerned with the decreasing models of healthy relationships teens had to emulate. Well, Charlie was a natural problem solver, so he searched for solutions and found there were few programs addressing the issues for youth. And so Charlie, with the support of fellow businessmen and educators, founded the Dibble Institute. There is more information on Charlie on our website. If you just go to About Us on our website toolbar, you can learn more. Well, Kathy, who is on our webinar who's new? I'd like for anyone who's new to the Dibble Institute to kindly click on the hand icon on your control panel. If you could do that, just take a second.
Well, it looks like
Kathy?
it looks like we've got a few new ones here, so that's very exciting. But then we have some that look like they have been here and seen our webinars before.
Oh, great. Well, welcome to all you new people. And we just want to take a few seconds here to explain to you who the Dibble Institute is and what we believe. We're often asked about our core values. While we are pro-marriage and pro-stable committed unions, we are not anti-divorce or anti-single parent. Relationships that are abusive of self or others should just simply not exist. We know that kids suffer considerably in high conflict and complex family homes. But all too often, a couple splits up for lack of good communications, conflict resolution, and other essential relationship skills. The impact of a lack of these skills often continues throughout the parenting years, even if the parent relationship no longer exists. When that happens, very often children suffer. And we do know that there are many heroic single parents doing amazing things out there. Finally, we believe that all young people deserve respect. All relationships can be improved with relationship skills. You will find that our materials can be used with broad audiences of young people including the GLBTQ youth. Our materials are used in both Planned Parenthood and in church programs. We never assume the gender of the young person's partner, and we have written scenarios that input from young person, from young people that address all kinds of current youthful situations. We feel very strongly that Charlie Dibble would be very proud of the work being done by our speaker today. Kathryn Edin is one of the nation's leading poverty researchers, deploying ethnographic observations, in-depth interviews, and mixed method approaches to work within the domains of welfare and low-wage work, family life, and neighborhood context. My first connection to Kathy was with the book Promises I Can Keep: Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage. She co-authored this with Maria Kafalis in 2005. Doing the Best I Can, Fathering in the Inner City, published in May of 2013 with Dr. Timothy Nelson, it reports on in-depth interviews with unmarried, low-income fathers who tell their side of the story. The book's intimate interviews make real the significant obstacles faced by low-income men at every step in the familial process, from the difficulties of romantic relationships to decision-making dilemmas at conception, to the often celebratory moment of birth, and finally to the hardships that accompany the early years of the child's life and beyond. For us at the Dibble Institute, this study screams for the need to integrate relationships of education into any public health, community, corrections, reentry, high school programming. Dr. Edin has a distinguished background in both sociology and public health. She is a distinguished Bloomberg professor in the Department of Sociology at the Zanville Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation and on Health and Human Services Advisory Committee for the Poverty Research Centers at Michigan, Wisconsin, and Stanford. And finally, Kathy is a founding member of the MacArthur Foundation-funded network on housing and families with young children, and a past member of the MacArthur Network on the family and the economy. She received her PhD in sociology from Northwestern and has taught at Rutgers, Northwestern, the University of Pennsylvania, and most recently Harvard University as a professor of public policy and management at the Harvard Kennedy School and chair of their multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy. Wow, Kathy, you have been busy. And I am so happy to welcome you to our webinar today, and so happy to share your information.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to have to be here, especially speaking to this audience who's so focused on relationship education. It's one of my passions, and I'm really eager to learn from the question and answer period, and feel free to follow up by email after the webinar if you have additional questions. So let's go ahead and advance to the first slide. So we began this project to address the problem of father absence among unmarried men. Public intellectuals from both sides of the political aisle were identifying this as a central problem of our time. And go ahead and advance to the next slide. We'll look at some examples of what this public discourse has looked like. David Blankenhorn, a leading conservative, writes that unwed fathers never signed on to anything. They never agreed to abide to any fatherhood code. They've never had any explicit obligation to either their children or the mothers of their children. Strong words. Next slide shows similar sentiments by William Bennett in his book, The Broken Hearth. It is unmarried fathers who are missing in record numbers, who impregnate women and selfishly flee, and it is these men above all who deserve our censure and disesteem. Now, on the next slide, we see something from the other side of the aisle. Here's Bill Cosby in a speech to the NAACP in 2004. No longer is a boy considered an embarrassment if he tries to run away from being the father of the unmarried child. And the next slide shows our own President, Barack Obama, speaking right before he was elected at the Apostolic Church of God in Chicago on June 15th, given the first of many Father's Day sermons. Here he says, too many fathers are missing from too many lives and too many homes. They have abandoned their responsibilities, acting like boys instead of men. We need fathers to realize that responsibility does not end at conception. We need them to realize that what makes you a man is not the ability to have a child. It is the courage to raise one. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. What these four quotes have in common is a diagnosis of the problem of father absence. These men don't care. What this project sought to do was to see if that was in fact the case. I have to say, we came into this project, Dr. Nelson, who's also my husband of 27 years, and I, without many preconceptions about what we would find. In fact, we thought Bill Cosby and William Bennett were probably right. It was a case of lack of caring. As you will see, what we uncovered was a much richer, more complex, and ultimately more hopeful story, especially from the point of view of relationship education. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the good news of our study and the bad news of our study. The good news is that we uncovered something that was quite remarkable, a strong father thirst among these men, a desire to be active, engaged fathers, fathers that were much different from the fathers these men experienced in their own childhoods, to be new dads. Across the culture, we know that men are more engaged in family life than they have been before, especially in terms of spending time with their children. But what we haven't known before is that fathers at the bottom, these unmarried men, these disadvantaged dads, are really seizing this ideal of the new father with great fervor and intensity. Next slide. So I moonlight as a demographer looking at representative data drawing from surveys, and I just thought I'd step back a minute and give some evidence for this father thirst, not just from our ethnographic work in Camden and Philadelphia, but from the numbers as well. And these results are drawn from the 1998 to 2000 baseline wave of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, which is a representative survey of urban births to women in large cities. What we learned from this survey and other administrative data is that the vast majority of the fathers show up at the hospital even though they're not married to the mother of the child, and actually participate in the birth of their child most of the time. A very large majority now voluntarily sign claiming that they're the legal father of the child at the hospital, and they do so without coercion. They're even eager to stake a claim that this child is theirs. When you survey moms and dads at the hospital right after the childs are born, both 80% of mothers and fathers say they're in a romantic relationship by the time the child is born. So the idea of sort of a lone single mother is a bit of a misnomer. 75% of the mothers and 90% of the fathers. Men are so optimistic. We see this across the data. Men are a little more optimistic than women. Say there is at least a 50-50 chance they're going to marry the other parent. But most put the chances not just at 50-50, but at good or certain. They really have high hopes for the relationship surviving. And almost all, 98%, say they intend to be actively involved in their children's lives. Next slide. So I'm going to tell a story from the field work, and this is actually a story of the first young man we met when we moved with our young children to America's Poor City, poorest city, Camden, New Jersey, to begin the study. This young man, Andre Green, was only a teenager, still in high school, when he became a father. And we asked Andre to describe to us the moment when he first learned his partner, the mother of his child, a young woman named Sonia, was pregnant. He describes the following scene. He's coming in from a church event, and he's walking into his aunt's row home where he's been staying with his mother and brothers because the family's had some trouble. And his aunt Charlene greets him at the door and says, "Hey, you know that girl Sonia used to go, you used to be talking to?" And he said, "Yeah, what about her?" And she kind of, nurses the drama of the moment and then spits out the word, "She's pregnant." Andre says he slams his fist on the counter of the kitchen as if enraged, says, "Oh man," and stomps up the stairs to his room, slamming the door. And then he turns to us and says that after ensuring that none of his cousins were in the room, he began dancing around saying, "Thank you, Jesus." As you can imagine, we were stunned by this story. What is a kid still in high school with no dad, a mom struggling with a drug addiction, a brother who's just been killed in the streets, and no prospects reacting in this way to a birth that's about to occur with a woman he's not even together with at the time? So in the next 8 years, as we explored more and more men's lives across 23 neighborhoods in Camden and Philadelphia, we expected to hear very different stories, stories of cutting and running, stories of fathers who, the moment they impregnated women, selfishly fled the scene, and instead leaving the mom holding the diaper bag. Instead, what we found is that Andre's story was more common than not. Now, Andre was a little bit more enthusiastic than most men, but if you turn to the next slide, you'll see that about 75% of men's reactions when they first heard the news were in those last two categories, accepting or happy. By the way, when we look at mothers, we find that only about 58% were accepting or happy. So fathers, again, show great optimism when faced with the revelation of an unplanned pregnancy. And as I'll show you in a minute, almost all of these pregnancies are unplanned, at least from the man's point of view. Next slide. So here's some quotes from our dads just to give you a flavor. Ozzy almost always wanted one. James has sort of a poignant quote: "When I found out she was pregnant, everything changed. I was like, I don't care if she was cheating." Tim says, "I didn't mind at all. I was happy." Stephen's response was probably the most common, as if, "Why are you even asking me this question?" He says, "I was glad. It was no major obstacle." Lacey was happy. Let's go on to the next slide. Here we see a few more quotes. Seven was just really excited. It was his first son, and he was just looking forward to it. James said, "I planned it." Okay, most of these pregnancies aren't planned, but James planned it. He said, "I said I wanted to have a kid. I wanted to get my girlfriend pregnant and have a baby." And he was still in high school, by the way, when this happened. Amin, who we're going to hear from later, says, "Even though I was not in love, I wanted a son." So very striking narratives we find across these 110 men about the great enthusiasm with which they approach parenting. Next slide. So it turned out that two of our questions were especially pivotal. The one I've already shared with you: what was your reaction when you first heard the news? And the second, what would your life be like without your child? So let's look at what men said to that. We thought, by the way, that men would say, "Oh, I would have been a CPA by now," or "I would have finished school," or I would, I wouldn't have child support dogging me all the time. Instead, what we saw is that men viewed kids as saviors. Rather than seeing their children as millstones, they saw them as life preservers. Kevin says he'd probably be in jail. Q says he'd probably be dead because of the simple fact that it wasn't until Brianna was born that I actually started to chill out. Mike says, I'd probably be dead somewhere, back in jail, in and out of rehab. That's given me something to fight for. Something like a destination. I got to go somewhere. Okay. Apple, I guess after I got caught up in the bad life as far as jail, the kids helped me keep my head up. Look forward. I got something to live for. Kids give you something to live for. 7 says, I couldn't imagine being without them, because when I'm spending time with my kids, it's like, now that's love. That's unconditional love. It's like a drug that you've got to have. I would never want to be without them. Next slide. White fathers, very similar quotes from the African American quotes, as you can see. Bill says, I'd still be out there. I'd still be on drugs and sick. I still think, but I think about my kids, and there's just this hope that I have now of getting a good relationship with them. Next slide. And we see very similar sentiments from our Latino fathers. I think that I would still have been on drugs and doing something criminal, Raymond said. It was really my daughter who changed me a lot. That's because she's so special, because she waked me up. Every time I see her, I be happy. Next slide. So we asked Elvis, next slide, what did you think your future was going to be before you had him? I wasn't going to live past the age of 30. And then once you had him, I can't even picture my life without Elvis in it. I had already made a promise to myself. I had told my friends I don't want to live past the age of 30. If I make it to 30, I'm going to take myself out. He came into the picture when I was like 27, and all that changed. Everything changed. My whole life changed. Next slide. Similarly, we asked Lacey, next slide, what would your life be like if you hadn't had your children? I can't imagine that one. I really can't, because my life without them, it would be empty. It would be empty, because that's what kept me going, knowing I had to come out of jail and be there for them. How did you see your future before you became a father? I didn't have no future. I didn't care. I lived for the moment. Did you think you would live to see 42? Nope. Nobody expected me to be there to see 17. Did you imagine you'd be doing something career-wise? No career. I'd be a big gangster. Next slide. As one father said, actually 2 fathers said this in the study, both Nelson Rios and in a prior respondent I just quoted. It is like a drug. Having children, having kids is like a drug you've got to have. Next slide. So the good news is that men value children. Unlike a prior generation of men, they want to embrace fatherhood in a meaningful way. They want to be there to witness the first words, the first step. They want to change the diaper. They want to participate in fatherhood by fixing their little girl's hair. Andre Green loves to put his daughter's hair into twists, and he shows her off at church every Sunday, and all the church ladies compliment him for the wonderful job he's doing with his daughter Jalissa's hair. Children have a tremendous power to transform disadvantaged young men's lives. I was talking to the director of child support enforcement at the White House on Monday, and she said, you know, what to do about these young disadvantaged men is really the problem of our time. And I think that's right. And what this research has really revealed is just the magic of children and the point, the possible turning point that children have in the lives of young men who really don't have much of a sense of direction, or frankly much of feeling of hope apart from their children. So next slide. But the bad news is that the process by which they go about becoming fathers, the process of relationship formation, really makes it difficult and creates long odds for a father to remain closely connected to his child throughout the life course. What ends up happening, as I'll show you, that well-intentioned men end up slaking the father thirst that pregnancy sparks through serial selective fathering. Now, this is a highly uneven pattern of fathering that involves being intensively engaged with your youngest child. Sometimes it's not a youngest child, but typically it is, but making little or no investments in the lives of other children. And we'll talk about the implications of serial selective fathering at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So let's talk about that relationship, the process of relationship formation, how these guys become fathers in the first place. Next slide. So let's go first to AMIN Jenkins, who hails from the Strawberry Mansion section of Philadelphia. And here he describes what constitutes the courtship with a woman who would become the mother of his second child, Antoine. Well, my youngest child's mother, I met her at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. She was attracted to me when I first saw her, and I made my approach. We began to socialize and communicate. And from there, we began to affiliate. And at some point in time, we became intimate. And my son was born. Now, what's really notable about this quote is not what it includes, but what it excludes, any real language of love or commitment or choice. In fact, very bureaucratic language replaces these words: socialize, communicate, affiliate. It's as if there's no real language to describe this thing that's not a real relationship, but it's not a casual liaison either. You also see the lack of intentionality with regard to childbearing. Somehow this man's son suddenly appeared. His son was born without a plan. Let's move next to a white father from I'm blanking on the name of this neighborhood, the Kensington section of Philadelphia. So this is a poor white community in the east, in sort of the eastern central region of the city. John CARR says, actually, she was dating a friend of mine and somehow she wanted me. But it was my friend's girl, so I didn't want to have nothing to do with it. But then my friend heard some shit and started talking shit and saying he would kick my ass. So I was like, whatever, then I will be with your girl. Eventually, I just got stuck with her for a while. So this is obviously not a narrative of choice. He's not carefully selecting the woman he wants to be the mother of his child, to carry his most precious asset into the world. Instead, the woman he becomes, he has a child with, is someone he just happens to be with when a pregnancy occurs. And of course, the phrase "just got stuck with her for a little while" doesn't indicate much love or commitment. Next slide. Now we go to another white father, Tim O'Brien, who says, I was hanging out at a friend of mine's house, and her and a couple of her friends were there, and she used to go out with my friend. My friend was trying to get back with her, and I ended up getting with her. We were only together for about 2 months, and she was getting pregnant. I didn't mind at all. Again, an accidental conception in very precarious circumstances in a very tenuous relationship produces a positive reaction from the would-be dad. Next slide. Now we turn to Will Donnelly, another white father hailing from the Fairview section of Philadelphia. I had just come out of a juvenile institution. I think I had just turned 17, and I started going with her friend. And then one day she came around and we started talking. Then I went with her and left her friend, and me and her got together. And we started having kids together, and then we got closer and closer. Then we started living together. So what Will's quote reveals is that the relationship is the outgrowth of the pregnancy, not the impetus. Having kids together is getting closer and closer is something that people accomplish after they've started having kids together and not before. Living together is something that may be accomplished after a pregnancy and not before. In fact, many of the cohabitations on our sample were sparked by a pregnancy. We call them shotgun cohabitations, but in many ways these are actually shotgun relationships prompted by an unplanned pregnancy. However, the transforming power of these pregnancies are very real. Let's now turn the slide and look at a quote from David Williams, who is an African-American father from Philadelphia. He says, when I was first with Deborah, this is the woman who becomes the mother of his child, I had a girlfriend on the side too, Kathy. She's someone I met at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. We got close and we were helping each other with our addictions. One thing led to another and we got intimate. Me and Deborah would get into an argument. She'd tell me to leave. I'd go stay with Kathy. And I asked, so how did you end up with Kathy? He responds, Deborah got pregnant. I had to do what was right. So again, one thing led to another, and David becomes You know, David has to choose, and he does the right thing and chooses Deborah. But what happens to the relationship after the pregnancy is announced is really remarkable. So let's turn to the next slide. Each month of the pregnancy, you know, we got closer and closer. I wanted to be with her more. And then like 2, 3 in the morning, she had me running to Pathmark, buying different foods. So that brought us closer and closer too. And then watching him born brought us even closer. On her last push, he came out spinning like a bullet. Nothing was more beautiful than Julian. The way he came out of his mother, that was amazing. And I held him, and I didn't want to let him go. So here, a relationship is transformed by pregnancy and then birth. Next slide. So in sum, the process of relationship formation, what we identify sort of as the fatal flaw in the recipe for success, given these really wonderful intentions these young men often have with regard to their children, is that most conceptions leading to a live birth are not planned. 50% of the conceptions, when we asked men what they, you know, whether they intended them or not, they told us they just weren't thinking at the time. You know, I often tease my audiences that if you're the, you know, the parent of a boy, you know exactly what this is all about. And only a very small portion, less than 1 in 5, show any level of intentionality. So it's something that just happens. Now, this is problematic because the relationship contexts in which these pregnancies occur are highly tenuous. There's usually a very short courtship, if it could even be called that. Many times men will say they weren't even in a real relationship. And men show very little selectivity. Pregnancy is what prompts the real relationship, but this relationship is very different from relationships we might have seen in the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s among men in this part of the income distribution. For those men, the mother-father relationship was really primary, and the father-child relationship was secondary. It was really hard to get men, you know, back in the day to care about their children unless they were with the mom. Or to be actively involved in their children's lives. Now what fathers are doing is really seeing the father-son, father-daughter bond as central, and the father-mother bond as much more peripheral. Now, of course, it turns out that the relationship is really important, as you all know, for keeping dad involved with his kid, but he undervalues that part of the equation when entering into fatherhood. Not only is his relationship also usually tenuous, so are his other circumstances. He's often unstably employed. He may be still ripping and running the streets. This might get him in and out of jail. Interrupting fatherhood at crucial times. Substance abuse problems are rife in this population, as is housing instability, and this really wreaks havoc, as you'll see, with visitation. So these kids are coming into men's lives at exactly the wrong time. Next slide. What are the consequences of this pattern of relationship formation? Despite the high hopes of the time the child is born, half of these relationships break up in the first year, and more than 2/3 by the child's 5th birthday. Only about 30% survive, right? And in the wake of a breakup, we often see highly, highly contentious co-parenting relationships. It's also true that mom and dad are in the process of churning through relationships. When he takes on new obligations with new romantic partners, with social children, and with new biological children, he may find that the obligations he's accrued are simply too overwhelming to manage. For her part, mom often begins to gatekeep when she enters into a new relationship. Sometimes it's because she wants to keep that relationship apart, together, and she's concerned that sexual jealousy between the old partner and the new partner will destabilize the relationship she now has and may have a new child with that partner. Other times, maternal gatekeeping, and this is a very important topic, is sparked by a woman's Temptation to swap daddies. She usually trades up when she gets a new partner. She gets a man with slightly better characteristics. And she may be tempted to think that the old dad is a bad bet and the new man is a better one. The problem is that her new relationships tend to be no more stable than her old ones, putting children on a father go-around where no man ends up being invested in their lives for long. And in demographic work, using fragile families, we've demonstrated that maternal gatekeeping is at least as big of a factor as male unemployment and incarceration. So very big topic, and a really, really rich subject matter for relationship skills programs to get couples engaged in. Next slide. So the typical father is not enmeshed in the kind of family you see inside the circle, which is what we might have expected, but next slide. What's in this circle? A highly complex family. And I should say that this level of complexity and instability that we now see in disadvantaged men's family lives is historically unique in the United States, and it's unique among rich nations. We are the only country in our peer group which is evidencing this pattern of highly unstable and complex families, and it's virtually all concentrated at the bottom of the income distribution among those women and men probably least able to cope given their financial and other circumstances. Next slide. So one more portrait from demography. This is the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and this is just a picture of what this serial selective fathering that ends up occurring looks like. We asked Dad, tell me about your relationship with the child you're most involved with. And here we see that among fathers who have all their children by one woman, that's no complexity, and fathers who have children by more than one woman, there's often a very intensive, almost daily interaction with at least one child. That's the good news. But in the second slide, we see a more complex picture. For these same men, those in complex families, those who engage in this serial fatherhood, they're leaving at least one of their children behind, almost completely. So let's go back to David Williams in the next slide and get a picture of how this looks. Of course, here's David with Deborah and his beloved son Julian, who he rushes home to see every night after his workday labor and sold newspapers on the side at the foot of the Ben Franklin Bridge. He may put Julian in a stroller and take him out along with Deborah's two children whose father is in prison. He's very engaged with these children. The little daughter calls him her daddy. They have a very sweet relationship. He donates all of his resources to this household, keeping nothing, almost nothing apart for himself. And by the lights of this household, he is a model father. But he's got two other sets of children for whom he is either not involved at all or only intermittently involved. So in these two households, he could rightfully be called a deadbeat. But what's really important and what a lot of social service providers miss is that the same father you're seeing that might look like a deadbeat is almost certain to be actively engaging in the life of another child. Next slide. So the bottom line is that this process of relationship formation puts men on a family go-round. This isn't fully satisfying to them. They'd like to do it in the right way. In fact, when you ask fathers what the ideal family should look like, shockingly, they point to Ward Cleaver. They really want to do things in the traditional way. They feel that their circumstances don't allow it, so they father in this highly imperfect way. Serial selective fathering. But it also, and more importantly, puts children on a father go-round, often with no adult male available to invest throughout the life course, to see them through middle school, high school, or college graduation. Next slide. So what are the solutions? I'm going to go through this quickly because I know we're going to talk about this a lot in the Q&A. But we focus far too little attention on prevention among men. Most of our prevention activities have focused on young women. Men need information. There are also very promising interventions that take advantage of cognitive behavioral therapy with young men to get them to stop, look, and listen before making decisions impulsively. We should deploy this rich data that's just emerging to engage in new interventions with young men to help them plan their pregnancies and to convince them that by doing so they can have richer relationships with their children and their children's mother. But second, we need to really capitalize on the father thirst and find ways to really connect fathers to these fragile families. They want to be with the child's mother. They want a parent co-residentially in a Ward Cleaver way, and we should really use everything in our relationship education arsenal to try to get these fathers there, not just because it benefits the child, but because it could be crucial to the young man's success as well. Next slide. So in conclusion, this is the book. We've arranged for a special 30% discount for anyone participating in this webinar. So if you go on the University of California website, simply enter the code 14W952. There's also a website called doingthebestican.com that has a lot more pictures of these men and their stories and resources that you can look to if you're interested in being a social entrepreneur in the domain of fatherhood and relationship education. So I'm going to end there, and I will welcome your questions.
Okay, if this is Kathy, if you all will take some time to put some questions in the box that you would like to have answered. I do have a couple right here, Kathy, already. Jessica asked a question that it's interesting that most of the positive comments about hearing the news were related to having a son. Were there equal comments about being happy for becoming a parent of any gender, or, for example, a parent of a girl?
This often comes up. Many men were very excited about having girls. Some actually preferred girls to boys. I think in the overarching literature, we do see a slight son preference, and but not a large one. And if you look at men's accounts, they do feel more competent with regard to sons. They also feel that they're less replaceable when it comes to sons because they can teach their sons something only a man can teach. But really, they're quite invested in their girls as well.
Okay, great. We had a couple of people kind of ask about similar thing here. Was any research done on reproductive coercion? It seems that could play into initial excitement about having a baby or men feeling that a baby saves them in some way.
Okay, so you know, our prior book, Promises I Can Keep, that was mentioned earlier. We talk with the mothers of these children, and these were not necessarily always the same couple, but they were interviews gathered from the same communities with mothers, and we didn't find, you know, sexual abuse and is not foreign to these communities for sure, as any child welfare worker will tell you, but sexual coercion was not the main way these children were coming into the world. Moms and dads were neither mothers or fathers claimed this, so I don't think it's a big factor, but I will say that there is evidence that you know, sexual abuse is common in this population, and that might weaken boundaries among both women and men when it comes to sexual activity, and they may end up engaging in sex earlier and in ways that are less protective of themselves because of early violations of that sexual boundary by brothers and uncles and fathers and other men in the community that have victimized them.
Okay, great. And this is a question I had just about the book itself. I think we probably didn't get the actual website on the screen. What website do they go to get the discount for your book?
They can go to the University of California Press website.
Okay.
And use that code, or they can go to the Doing the Best I Can website.
Okay.
Either way, you could order it.
Okay, great. Another question Jessica's asking is, did any of the fathers you interviewed identify as gay?
Well, no. However, this is not something that's foreign. And in fact, several of our fathers now, years later, have become bisexual or have, claimed a gay identity. So this is something that's gaining social acceptability in low-income neighborhoods. It's more common than it was, and it's something young people are struggling with, but not in the social acceptability has definitely grown, and there's more room for young people to express themselves, to express their preferences in that way than there has been in the past.
Okay, great. Another question, which I think is interesting: how do we capitalize on the father thirst before pregnancy with the youth ages 18 to 24?
Well, if you can convince these young men, let me tell you a little story. I was doing a presentation for the child welfare folks in New York City, and on the panel was a young man named Elliot, who was a young father. And I was talking about the importance of information, prevention. And a woman stood up in the audience and said, these young men's brains are not fully developed. How could information help? They're not really making decisions anyway, or they're not capable of making good decisions anyway. And Elliot was really taken aback and offended by this comment. And he said, you people spent years talking to me about STDs in my sex education classes. Why didn't anyone tell me about child support? Why didn't anyone tell me that it was important to have a good relationship with my child's mother so I could, so I could maintain access to my child? I would have acted differently had I had that information. So information, I think, is really important. If men care about fathering, if it's something they want to engage in, we might well be able to convince them it's worth waiting to do fathering at the right time and in the right way. It's tricky, right? Because ultimately, this father thirst is really driven by a despondency and a lack of hopelessness. In Andre's case, he talks so much about all of the negativity all around him, and this baby was like a magic wand that neutralized all the, this was the most violent year in Camden's history, actually, the year he became a dad. But a young essay contest winner, LaCondia Catlett, an 8th grader in Camden, wrote an essay for the Stop the Violence campaign, and it went loosely like this. Every time I pick up the newspaper, I hear about a shooting or a death in Camden, and it makes me so sad about my city. And in the end, she ends the essay with the words, "Put down the guns and pick up the babies." And that's what Andre thinks he's doing. And until we restore hope in low-income communities, we're going to see, everyone needs meaning. Young people, if you've ever raised a teenager, you know that this quest for meaning and identity is so essential to that part of the life course. We've got to provide more outlets and more of a sense of hope and meaning. So hope and meaning, important, but so is information, and perhaps these stop, look, and listen type interventions which employ cognitive behavioral therapy that gets young men to slow down and think rather than react impulsively could really help men delay parenting and wait to parent within relationships that are more stable and fully formed.
Very good. And Irene, do you have something you want to add to that from the Dibble Institute as well about how we feel or what needs to be done to help these young men?
Well, it's so much of at least Marlene Pearson's approach and philosophy does take into consideration through the eyes of the child. Uh, what do you want for your future child that you have this father thirst for? And specifically covers a lot of the issues for young males and does approach the issue of young males and their choices in pregnancy along with the women. So it just speaks and parallels what Kathryn has said today.
And it's never too late for prevention, right? So even if a young man has had a first child, getting him to stop, look, and listen about future family formation, and really to consider the cost of a complex family. Just the child support implications alone are huge, because you pay a much higher percentage of your income if you have your children across multiple households. In fact, it can easily take up half of your income. So it's very, very costly for young men to engage in complex family formation, not only from a child support point of view, but from a sheer management point of view. And talking with them about that after they've had that first child, and getting them to think about what it might cost that relationship for them to take on more obligations and new relationships is really worth thinking about.
Okay, great. We've got a few more questions if we have time, Irene.
Sure.
I think you may have answered this in your talk, Kathy, but Maria asked, how much longer do you need to follow the fathers to see if they're engaged with their children when they're of college age? And I know you started a lot of this the research when they were in high school, right?
Well, the data that I drew on, I think we want to look to survey data for that, because we do have fathers at all parts of the life course in our study. We interviewed fathers from 14 to 64. But the best data sources on the pattern of father engagement start following young men in high school, like the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth and Keep Going. And what we're seeing, right now the men in that survey are 27 to 30 years old. So it remains to be seen as the survey continues to follow them, what their pattern of involvement will be. An earlier cohort of these men showed, that at least hinted that there may be a learning curve with regard to fathering. And certainly we see that in our ethnographic data, that fathers seem to learn over time how to select more carefully, and how to have, they also sort of age out of a lot of the ripping and running kind of behavior that makes them so difficult as partners. So, engaging with those youngest children might be a far more productive and successful enterprise when you're 35 than when you're 18 years or 20 years old. So we have suggestions that men do better when they're older, and this is all the more reason why, rather than having their first child at 21 or 22, which is what they typically do now, that needs to be moved forward to when they begin to engage meaningfully in a career, which tends to be 25 and older. So right now there's too much of a distance between when men have their first child and when they really begin to engage in stable labor market activity.
Okay, and this might have a little bit to do with what you just said. Tara said that prevention was mentioned as a solution. Her question is it prevention in the sense of basic contraception, or prevention in terms of delaying having a child?
Okay, so I asked, when I was first living in Camden, I asked one young man, what about contraception? He says, oh, in my high school, like, the condoms are hanging from the ceiling. They're pressing, condoms 24/7. And in Philadelphia, actually, there are clinics in many schools. Now, it's not to say that if everyone had a LARC, long-acting contraception, you wouldn't see a reduction in pregnancy. Certainly, young men and women, have at least the aspiration to wait. I think what becomes difficult is that children provide so many positives in a situation where there are so few positives. So it's just not the worst thing that can happen to you when you don't have we don't have a lot of other prospects. And in many times it can really give you a sense of meaning and a sense that you have the future. It has the potential to do that, at least. Although if you fail, the consequences to self-esteem are profoundly devastating. It's very tricky.
Okay, and I think we have probably time, Irene, maybe for one more question. Tanya wants to know, was there any feedback collected from fathers in regard to how they feel about raising the children of other men? I know that you mentioned that about in one of the scenarios and one of the fathers that you worked with, but
Yes.
this woman's curious as to what they think about the other fathers that are not caring for their own children.
Right. So nobody receives harsher condemnation in a low-income neighborhood than a father who stepped away from his responsibilities to his kids. There's actually positive social pressure now to stay involved. This was not true, as far as we can tell, this was not true in the 60s, the 70s, even the 80s, but there's really been a shift in what's considered socially acceptable in low-income communities. So if you're that dad, you're gonna receive a lot of social condemnation. Now you can kind of recover your reputation by really engaging with a younger child, saying, yeah, I know I messed up, but look at me now, and we really see men doing this. In terms of social children, however, if a child is young enough and the other dad's not involved, men often relish playing the father role to social children, and in fact, they can be intensely meaningful relationships. However, older children often don't want to call this new guy dad, and there's a lot of tension. So it's really with the younger children that, especially if they get in right at the beginning when the children really don't have a sense of who their own biological dad is, maybe he's in jail, that they can form these really special bonds with these social children. The problem is when that relationship breaks up, the mother doesn't want him to continue to maintain that relationship. You can see her point of view. However, it can be devastating to the dad and to the child as well. So this is part of why women are kind of short-sighted when they swap daddies and push social fathers into the role of daddy while pushing the biological daddy away. These relationships are seldom lasting. When they are lasting, they can be really meaningful and supportive, but unfortunately, they don't tend to survive the breakup of the couple relationship.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you that did ask questions that I did not get to or Kathy did not get to, we will surely have someone either email you or we will be in touch with you for sure. So thank you so much, Kathy. And Irene, would you want to?
Well, yes, and just as a parting comment on that last comment from Kathryn is how important communication skills are. I think, the awkwardness of how to continue communicating with the biological father when you're in a new relationship. Not that that is the only issue going on, but certainly I think communication can help and give them that vehicle of
That's
helping
right.
them through that. So
That's right.
yeah, well, thank you, thank you, Kathryn. I tell you, it's just been a lot of great information, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to keeping in touch with you through our Dibble e-newsletter, where you can remain current on issues relating to teen, young adult views, programs, and research, much like Dr. Edin's. We ask and invite you to like us on Facebook and LinkedIn. And if you wish to order any materials following this broadcast, you can do so online at our website at thedibleinstitute.org or by calling our phone number, which will be on the screen, I think, in a minute. All orders following the live presentation of this broadcast are eligible for free shipping. Be sure to use the code webinar at the checkout. And let's see, Kathy, is there anything else? If you have any questions later, because sometimes things come to mind, please feel free to let us know, and if we can.
Hello?
I'm sorry, where did you lose me? I don't know what happened
I
there.
did lose you.
Got
I'm
muted.
sorry.
um, did you hear about the free shipping and all that?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. Our webinar again will be available in about 3 days. Questions can be referred to myself or Kathy for how our programs can help you to answer some of the questions that and issues that you have in your work. Kathy, what is the July webinar about?
Well, I'm very excited about the July webinar. The title of the webinar is Beyond the Fed's Proven Fundraising Strategies for Healthy Relationship Programs. So I'm sure there are no programs out there that are needing extra money. I'm saying that, but I know all of us can use a little extra money to help out. And we are very proud to have a panel with us next week from 3 different areas in the country. We have Aaron Stone with us from who is the Executive Director of Relationship Skills Center in Sacramento. We have Kathy Schleier with us from the United Way. She is Executive Director of Family Frameworks in Dalton, Georgia. I'm sorry, she works with the United Way in getting funding. We also have Carol Jackson. She is the Program Director of Families Matter in Memphis, Tennessee. But they're going to give us some real live examples of how they fund their programs using private sector funding. And I look forward to seeing you, and the registration will be up tomorrow. Actually, I believe it's up now, and you will get an email about that tomorrow as well. So thank you so much, and you all have a great evening.
And just a quick reminder, a short survey following this as soon as you log off. We appreciate your help in providing us with information of how we can better serve you. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us again, and I look forward to future webinars with you. Bye, everyone.